By easing the lockdown, the government intended to usher in a new phase in the politics of COVID-19. But with polls for the first time since this crisis begun showing the majority of the public are dissatisfied with the government's response to COVID-19, are the government seeing a turning point which they didn't bargain for? To discuss that question, I'm joined by Ash Sarkar and Aaron Bastani. How are you both doing?
Very good.
Feeling fine, keeping it
Great.
clean, pristine, and on the Dean, as per usual.
You kind of look like you're dressed for the autumn, Ash, because you kind of got the coat, the hair up. It's kind of like an autumn vibe.
Well, see, that's a greasy hair necessity vibe, and I didn't
Right.
have time to try it before the show. And this is a denim jacket because otherwise that's too cool.
Very
You know,
racy.
jump too hot. So, you know, I'm dressing up for you
I
two.
did my first, state-sanctioned sunbathe today, but I do want to point out that whilst I look really pink, that's definitely the sort of lighting and something about my camera. I'm not sure what's going on there. I didn't get sunburn. On tonight's show, we are going to discuss, whether the polls and public opinion has turned on the government's approach to coronavirus, also on the immigration bill, which is being debated in the Commons as we speak. And then we're going to talk about the Lib Dems report into their election defeat and some briefing against Chuka Umunna. And then we will finish with a discussion of Keir Starmer getting smeared again, but this time it really backfiring on the Daily Mail in more ways than one. As ever, tweet your comments on the hashtag TiskiSour and share the show link. So, first story. On this show, we have discussed the multiple failings of the government's handling of COVID-19. From a late lockdown to a lack of PPE and slowness in testing, the government has been behind the curve. They've often seemed more interested in public relations and public health, and the consequences have been tragic. However, up to now, this has not been reflected in public opinion. We've usually been told that whilst people on Twitter are moaning at the government response, this is out of tune with the public mood, who are all rallying behind the government's effort in an unprecedented political and public health crisis. However, it seems two polls, or at least two polls on the weekend, suggest that might have changed. For the first time, it looks as if more of the public are saying they are dissatisfied with the government's response to coronavirus than saying they are satisfied. Let's start with the opinion poll. So this was done for the Observer. Approval of the government's handling of the coronavirus crisis drops 9 percentage points in 1 week. And it's worth keeping this up for a moment as well, because you can see some key dates here. So at the moment, 42% of people say they disapprove of the government's handling of the coronavirus crisis. 39% disapprove of it. 39% say they approve of it. And you can see two big spikes in here. Two big spikes in terms of the public's approval. So one of them was just after the first lockdown was introduced. And the second one, 7th to 9th of April, is just after Boris Johnson went to ICU. So you can see two big bounces then. And other than that, it's basically a bit of a secular decline all the way up to the present. And in case you thought that was the quirk of a single poll, we can also get up the Sky and YouGov poll, which shows exactly the same pattern. So that poll now has 49% thinking the government have handled coronavirus badly, 47% thinking they have handled it well. And that's from a peak in terms of the government's popularity on this particular issue, where back on the 27th of March, that was just after that first lockdown was introduced, 72% thought the government were doing well and 21% thought they were doing badly. So a net 51% approval of the government's response. So completely overwhelming. And that has shifted quite quickly. Ash, are you surprised at this particular shift right now? Is this something that you think will be a short-term quirk, or is this now where our politics is going? People have seen that the government were a shambles over the first 2 months of this crisis. It's killed many people. More people are, it seems, dying in Britain than in any other country in Europe, and those chickens are coming home to roost.
Well, the problem for the government isn't just the policy failures of how slow we were to enter lockdown, the suspension of community tracing, getting it back up and running, is that now, as we're in this sort of strange period where the government's encouraging people to get back to work, but there's not the infrastructure to safely manage it, is that across the board, they're making it up as they go along. And that's abundantly clear to the public. So last week, you even had, Phil and what's her face? Holly? Is that her name? The one
Holly
on This
Willoughby.
Morning?
Yeah.
Holly Willoughby.
And Philip Schofield.
And Philip Schofield, I find her completely interchangeable with the one that's called Tess.
Tess Daly.
Yep, sorry, I get confused. So Phil and Holly, even they were saying, we've managed to sort of keep our, morale up all this time. We just want clear instructions. And now it feels like being picked up and dropped. And that was on the business of, could you see your parents or not? And so this kind of conflicting messaging has an attritional effect on the confidence of the public. The Tories are allowed to be malevolent. They get into hot water when they begin to look incompetent. And it's not inevitable that in the face of the COVID-19 crisis that your approval ratings will slide as a government. Jacinda Ardern's party have enjoyed a 14-point poll bounce in New Zealand. And that just goes to show that with, strong policy, success at containing the virus, but also a projection of a sense of certainty and that there is a plan, is that an incumbent government can come out looking pretty good after all this.
And we should actually, before I go to you, Aaron, let's just look at the polls as well, because obviously the Conservatives are still way ahead. But according to this poll by Redfield and Wilton Strategies, no, I hadn't heard of them either, but they are approved by the British Polling Council, so we can see them as the methods pass those tests, so we can get that up. The Conservatives on 47%, which is obviously still way ahead, but down 3 points. Labour on 35%, up 4 points. Yes, we are 4.5 years away from a general election, so we shouldn't necessarily take these too seriously, but it can be an indication of the direction of travel in terms of British public opinion. Aaron?
I mean, how are the Lib Dems on 9% is the big one for me. They've sort of rudderless, no leader. All they stood for over the last 2 years was Brexit. I haven't seen any distinct message on the coronavirus. I agree we shouldn't read too much into it, but still, that's impressive. It's at the very least a consolidation of the vote that you saw in the general election, and hopefully growing on it, which is the very least you would hope from Keir Starmer as party leader. I do think, though, we have to sort of place this in a broader context, because while on the one hand, again, why are so many people still, almost 40%, thinking that the Tories have done a good job on coronavirus? Well, the public, and we've said this repeatedly, while the public health sort of response has been shambolic, the economic response has been pretty impressive. And if you look at the personal approval ratings of Keir Starmer, Boris Johnson, but then also Rishi Sunak, it's the last guy that comes out on top. And that shouldn't really be a surprise, because you're a very young, telegenic politician who's, running a 20% budget deficit, giving money away. That's always very, very popular. And people have to work really hard not to really like a party that's doing that. So I think, given what's happening with the deficit, given the generosity, especially within the context of Tory sort of orthodoxy, of the furlough scheme, I think that really speaks the absolute calamity of the public health response. It'd be interesting if you had a bit of nuance there, polling on that. What do you think of the furlough scheme? What do you think of the ability to mitigate or minimize the spread of the virus? I would submit that actually the response to the economic stuff is pretty good, and the public health stuff is a shambles. Now, the important thing there is the government doesn't intend to keep the economic stuff going for that much longer, primarily because it can't afford to. We'll probably see something resembling the furlough scheme go all the way through to October, but it's certainly not going to go far beyond that. And the public health stuff, well, again, that's probably only going to get worse, because, of course, the government is now banging the drum for us to all go back to work. And so it suggests that things could get very bad very quickly for the Tories, especially after June 1st.
That's interesting, that point about breaking it down, because even when actually the public's overall ratings of the government's response to coronavirus was positive, when they were asked, when the public were asked individual questions about how well do you think the government has done on testing, how well have they done on PPE, etc., it was nearly always overwhelmingly negative. So it seems like the addition of, or the assemblage of all those different opinions together have finally sort of crystallized into dissatisfaction with the government in general. I mean, also, you have seen a change in tone in some of the main sort of media outlets, although it's always difficult to say whether on issues like this they are following or shaping public opinion. Something that came up there was sort of like incompetence in the messaging. There was a bit of an example of this today, kind of silly, but still worth looking at. So one of the key criticisms of the government's response to this crisis has been how lax they have been in terms of controlling who does and who doesn't come into the country. Or, I mean, I suppose a better way of putting this is quarantining people who come in. I don't think the demand needs to be to close Britain's borders, but to have some sort of enforced system whereby if people are coming from a place with lots of coronavirus, you say they should stay and self-isolate for 14 days. Obviously, this didn't happen in Britain. The most high-profile case of this was on the 11th of March, and when thousands of Atletico Madrid fans came to a match in Liverpool, just as Madrid was, the big hotspot of coronavirus at that point in time. No checks. You had people like John Ashton, a public health, or he was a public health England guy. He was on Question Time saying this will be spreading so much coronavirus around now. Now the people who are actually employed by the government are saying that. But anyway, one other issue is the tardiness to impose quarantine on people coming from Wuhan. And this was asked to Jonathan Van Tam today. So he's a Deputy Chief Medical Officer, and this is how he responded.
Well, my recollection is we did do it before, that on the 29th of February, and then I think on the 30th of February, we announced that travellers returning from the hotspot of Wuhan and then Hubei province respectively, when they arrived in the UK, must self-isolate at home.
Did anyone notice the problem there?
I don't think that there's ever been a 30th of February.
You don't need a deep knowledge of Britain's response to coronavirus to know what that man just said was nonsense, because there has never ever been a 30th of February. We are in a leap year, so there is a 29th of February, but there is not a 30th of February.
I mean, who knows? Like, maybe Jonathan Van Tam, rolls through the club with 50-11 girls. Like, maybe he's just having some fun with numbers there. That's what you want out of a Deputy Chief Medical Officer.
When did it happen? I mean, because you can sort of maybe forgive a brain freeze if it was March the 1st, but I mean, I don't think those dates
it was the
actually...
29th and 30th of January, so he got the month wrong.
Yeah,
just
okay.
Unfortunately, he got the month wrong on the 1 month where that date doesn't even exist, let alone it being the wrong date. It's just a date that doesn't exist. I mean, that
being
was
a month out is kind of bad. I mean,
that is kind of bad when you speak to the country. I mean, it also, even that on the 29th and 30th of January was very late. You already had people 3 flights a week coming directly from Wuhan to Heathrow up to very late in January. And people were just told to keep an eye out for symptoms. That was all. No one was told you should quarantine for 14 days. They were just saying, well, if you get sick, maybe call this number.
But we've also had the problem where the symptoms list has only just been updated to include loss of taste and smell today. And there were reports emerging of those being 2 really common symptoms from way in early March. So the problem there is that you have thousands of people wrongly being told that they don't have to self-isolate, right? Thousands of people. So that's another thing which hugely impacts human behavior and determines the spread. Obviously through social media, these things start to trickle down. So regardless of whether or not you see it on government websites or in the advice that you should self-isolate with loss of taste and smell, people start to get a sense that that's going on. But again, you just think of all these missed opportunities on quarantining travelers, also from Italy. You had plenty of people coming from Spain and Italy who didn't have their temperatures taken, and asked to quarantine and still aren't. And all of these things, you just think they're just locking the stable door after the horse has already bolted. And I think that's what lends the sense of they're making it up as they go along, which is, oh, that's a great announcement for 2 months ago.
You know what else was happening in late January, Ash?
Bonger Bob for Big Ben Brexit bong.
Yeah, it suggests that our entire political class and their friends in the media were focused on something altogether different rather than an imminent global pandemic. Poor us.
Well, there's also another issue, isn't there? Which is, was it that they didn't have their eye on the ball, or was it that the government have consistently prioritized the economy over our public health? And are they doing it again? So there was another story today which was suggesting that perhaps the government haven't learnt their lesson when it comes to putting safety first. And this is off the back of the news that the track and trace system, which we were promised would be in place round about now, won't be in place until early June at the earliest. And as we said on Friday's show, actually, I think this would be, it's disappointing when governments miss targets, but also it's forgivable. What's unforgivable is when they miss that target and don't change their other plans. And that's what's going on right now. I want to go to some copy from The Independent today off the back of a press conference with the government spokesman, with the Downing Street spokesman. So both the tracking scheme and the launch of the smartphone app alongside it have been put back until the end of the month at the earliest, a 2-week delay with phase 2 of restriction easing due to start on 1st of June. But Boris Johnson's spokesperson said phase 2 would not be delayed even if testing and tracing was not ready, and insisted there was no explicit link. the rollout was due to start this week, but will now only get underway at best as phase 2 of lockdown easing, including schools reopening for some pupils, is due to begin on the 1st of June. So what have we got here? We have, at the beginning of the month, you've got a government who says, key to our plan for easing the lockdown is that we're going to have a track and trace system in place. What does that mean? It means that we can find the virus in the population, trace who people have been in contact with, and then isolate them, crucially isolate them so that they don't spread it. And that should be a precondition for easing the lockdown, because it means that whilst we have contact with more people again, we can have confidence that those people who we're in contact with don't have coronavirus. Now what's happened is that test and trace system has been very late in its fruition, but the government haven't adjusted those plans. So they've decided that even if the contact tracing system isn't in place, we're still going to go ahead with the reopening of the economy. And that to me seems, again, like what they are doing is valuing the economy over public health, and also potentially, on the sly, doing the herd immunity strategy, which they were adopting from the start. That was the reason why they didn't bother restricting travel or quarantining people who'd come from places where there were high degrees of coronavirus, because they thought, well, it's going to come here anyway, and we kind of want people to catch it. We need it to move through the population so that ultimately we get herd immunity. And it seems like that is quite possibly still the strategy. Aaron or Ash, before we go on to our next topic, which is the immigration bill, any final thoughts?
I just very briefly want to come in on the importance of contact tracing. So we know that it works best when you've got quite a low R number, because it's easier to have an effective contact tracing program when you've got fewer people that you have to contact trace. So you're dealing with clusters of infections which are in the single or double digits rather than hundreds or potentially thousands. And that's why it's so important to get it in place before you start reopening mass gatherings, schools, and so on and so forth. But the other reason why I think it's really important, something which I don't hear mentioned very much, is that it allows you to, open up public life again in a way which also is inclusive of vulnerable and elderly people, because you've got a much clearer sense of where the virus is, of which regions are particularly affected, where those clusters of infection are, and acting on them quickly. So you won't necessarily have this two-tier system where you've got people just being locked away for God knows however many months. So those of us who've been insisting on contact tracing being a precondition of lifting lockdown restrictions, we've often been caricatured as being pro-lockdown in any circumstances, and not being, aware or empathetic with the fact that people who are elderly and people who are vulnerable need to live their lives too and be out in society and enjoying themselves. No, this is quite the opposite. This is saying that you won't have to have as strict shielding measures if you've got very, very good contact tracing and mass testing in society at large.
Aaron?
No, I think we've said everything we need to say about contact tracing. I think you've been the Don. Ash has been fantastic. Ash's tweets always bang, but I think on this show, Michael, I think you've always offered a very lucid account of the government's failures on test and trace, and how, it was only 2 weeks ago we were being told we were going to adopt a South Korea model. It's kind of weird, It
is so weird.
And then, within 3 or 4 days,
briefings. There were explicit briefings saying Boris Johnson, because he had to go to ICU, has understood the seriousness of coronavirus. And because through this sort of awakening that he had when he nearly died, he's like, oh, actually, coronavirus is really serious. I don't want other people to get it. He's going to adopt the Korea model, which is you have a very harsh lockdown until you have a proper track and test, trace, isolate system in place. We're not going to do Sweden. We're going to do South Korea. And what's happened now? We've reopened the economy. We've got rush hour on tubes with people not wearing face masks, and we don't have any kind of test and trace and isolate system in place. So, it looks like we're going for Sweden, doesn't it?
But do you know what I'd call Michael Walker's coverage? Just very quickly, and I've been very impressed with it over the last few months. And I feel you've been a real beacon, and you've been a real thought leader in this. But you know what I'd call you most of all?
What?
I would call you forensic.
Yeah, I knew that was coming. All right, we've got 1,800 people watching tonight. Let's see if we can get that to 2,000 in here and share the stream. Of course, I'm going to go to one super chat. So Jason Dugenis, €10 super chat. Every flyer to Greece gets tested at the airport, then transported to hotel where they stay for 24 hours until their results arrive. Simple and doable. Absolutely simple and doable. Our government isn't very good at simple, doable things. It sort of likes to stand up at those press conferences and say, well, that might sound simple, but actually we've done the modeling and we think it's not necessarily the most. And it's like, when we
What's
had
going to be
Bill
much
Hana-
more effective is getting 80-year-olds to understand how Bluetooth works on their phone and keep it running all the time.
when we had Bill Hanard on, he said, actually, who's an associate professor of epidemiology at Harvard, he said, actually, the modelers often are getting it wrong, because sometimes what you want to just say is, look, this is common sense. Just do the common sense. Look, if this is what's happening in Italy, then we should do a lockdown now instead of having this. Anyway, next story. The government's new immigration bill was today debated in the House of Commons. The bill will officially end freedom of movement within the European Union and introduce a points-based system to replace it. We've discussed this on previous shows, but to recap, let's take a look at this chart from Sky, which summarizes what's in the bill particularly well. So as you know, this is a points-based system. How it's going to work is you're going to need 70 points to be eligible to apply for a visa to come to the UK. The essential ones are an offer of a job by an approved sponsor, so you can't come to Britain without a job, like you would have been able to if you were a European citizen while we were still a member of the European Union. A job at an appropriate skill level gets you 20 points. Speak English at required level gets you 10 points. And then you need 20 points from somewhere else in this list. And the most contentious one really is that you need a salary of £25,600 or above to get those 20 points. Now we can see, in a moment, we'll all debate the contents of that bill. But first, I think what was specifically interesting today in the debate in the House of Commons was that it put on show two different styles of opposition on the Labour benches. One where you say, we're going to oppose this wholly because we don't agree with what the Conservative Party are doing. The other, which is a sort of constructive form of, we will potentially vote for it with some clarifications. Let's start with the Shadow Home Secretary, Nick Thomas Simmons, speaking and summing up, really, the Shadow Cabinet's stance on the bill.
In the midst of this crisis, the government is putting forward an immigration system containing a salary threshold of £25,600 that sends a signal and tells people that anyone earning less than that is unskilled and unwelcome in our country. We on these benches know that people are not being paid the value of what they do, and that what our frontline workers earn does not reflect what they contribute to our society. Many of us didn't need reminding of that, but it seems the government does need reminding. Those who clapped on Thursday are only too happy to vote through a bill today that will send a powerful message to those same people that they are not considered by this government to be skilled workers.
That was Nick Thomas Simmons there, focusing on how the bill would categorise many people we clap for on Thursdays, people who are working in health and care sectors or any essential workers, as low-skilled and unwelcome because they don't meet that income threshold. Labour are whipping against the bill on those grounds. But Chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, Yvette Cooper, wasn't adopting the same tone. Let's take a look.
So I believe that this bill is flawed, but I recognise that immigration is needed. I recognise that legislation on immigration is now needed. And as Select Committee Chair, I will put forward amendments that I hope will receive cross-party support. So in that cross-party spirit, I will not vote against the bill tonight, although if the government's approach does not change, I would expect to oppose it when it returns to the House, because I think it is immensely important. We should be trying to build that new consensus, and I urge the government to do so because it has the opportunity to do so now. There will always be disagreements on different aspects of immigration, but right now, at this point, particularly in this coronavirus crisis, we should be looking for the areas where we can find agreement and find a positive way forward.
So Yvette Cooper there. It's important to mention, actually, this was the second reading of the bill. So the second reading of the bill is where you vote for, in principle, do you support the general outlines of this bill or not? Nick Thomas Simmons and the Labour front bench are saying we don't agree with the general outlines. Yvette Cooper is saying, I agree with the general outlines, but I will reserve the right to vote against it on the third reading. So her strategy is to say, I'll vote for it now, try and get some amendments through, and then vote for or against it afterwards. You can also vote against it now and also try and get amendments through. But in any case, I'm going to start with you, Aaron. It's a bit surprising, isn't it? If someone was to say, who do you think will be the first MP to rebel against Keir Starmer? You might have guessed Richard Bergen. You wouldn't necessarily have guessed Yvette Cooper. Are you surprised by what's going on in the Commons right now?
Hard to say. I mean, it's quite predictable. I tweeted this is so eerily reminiscent of 2015, and I was thinking in particular of the welfare bill, where many members of the shadow cabinet then, of course, there was the interim leadership of Harriet Harman, abstained. And that was because it was the first reading, the second reading, very technical stuff. Now, given all that, and given clearly Yvette Cooper is somebody who is quite prone to that sort of technocratic bent, I think that's quite predictable on the one hand. On the other hand, I do genuinely think she has the completely wrong political position on this, given the present political moment. And I think obviously Nick Thomas Simmons has got the right one. On the one hand, you would say quite rightly, well, the government have a mandate to change immigration laws in this country. We're leaving the EU, so obviously they're going to have to change it in some way or other. So I get that. And also the fact is her seat voted to leave. Her majority is really small now. So a lot of these Labour MPs and formerly Brexit voting seats are going to feel like they have to lean into the kind of anti-immigration vote. All of that's moderately explicable, let's say, not understandable, explicable. But the manner in which she communicated the point was just pathetic. And I do think that a vast majority of the electorate right now totally grasp and agree with the idea that people like care workers, cleaners, should be paid more. And the fact that she's not willing to, catalyze that conversation, also talk about the need for workers from all around the world to maintain the NHS, to keep our streets clean, et cetera, et cetera. Not that they should be doing just those jobs, by the way, but clearly many of them do in these so-called unskilled jobs. I think it just speaks to her lack of ambition and talent as a politician. And the fact she became a cipher for so many for so long, I think really speaks to the profound idiocy of what passed for anti-Corbyn politics over the last 5 years.
I mean, in a way, I'm going to go to you, Ash. Something that's sort of, I think, almost fortunate for the Labour Party is that this was always going to be an incredibly difficult issue for them, because the immigration issue is very wrapped up with Brexit, obviously. It doesn't, the Labour Party don't want to look like they are fighting the same battles as 2016 about freedom of movement. So I think there probably is a recognition on the Labour benches that immigration has to change somehow. But they didn't really want to vote for it because, in part because it makes them seem anti-migrant, and in a way it is anti-migrant. They've found now sort of a means by which they can oppose it, which they think can sidestep that particular conflict about migration, which is about care workers and the value of low-skilled workers. But I haven't heard from them, what they would propose as an alternative to this bill. So in a way, the fact that it's further down on the news agenda, because obviously bigger things are happening than bills being passed in the House of Commons, and also that the issue of care workers coming along has meant that they can sort of position themselves against this bill without really taking much of a risk on the immigration issue in general.
Which is what makes Yvette Cooper's behaviour so strange. Now, I do think that Yvette Cooper, when she has appeared on select committees, she's been a very thorough and formidable interrogator, particularly up against Amber Rudd. I don't think that means that she's got particularly sharp political strategy. And I think that this is a case of where you're mistaking these like very technical, nitty-gritty parliamentary, procedural nonsense that most of the country either don't know or don't care about, and you're sacrificing the opportunity to make a clear moral articulation of your politics. And I do think that's important, because we're in a situation where there is an absolutely stonking Conservative majority. You don't have to be the make or break vote. You in a way are a bit freer to actually articulate the things that you believe in. I think the problem for Yvette Cooper, and I think the Labour Party at large when it comes to immigration, doesn't really know what it believes in. It doesn't know what it can do and what it wants to do when it comes to shoring up this, completely fractured electoral coalition. Now, I wrote an article a few weeks ago because it was the 10-year anniversary of Gordon Brown's Bigot Gate. We all remember that. Gillian Duffy, 2010 election, Gordon Brown is caught on a hot mic saying, why did you put me with that bigoted woman? And it was seen as this moment of, high-handed, dismissive Labour politicking, right? It's, condescending, and it's unkind, and it's ungrateful to its sort of core base of voters. And it's that unstable class of voters, sort of town living, North and the Midlands, older, tends to be white British compared to a much more solid BAME vote concentrated in metropolitan areas, Manchester, Liverpool, London, so on and so forth. And I keep coming back to that moment because it's like, so what did Gordon Brown do wrong? And there's one group of people that say that Gordon Brown got it wrong because he disagreed with the electorate and it revealed the disdain for the values of the electorate. That was a bad thing. And other people would say that, you know, he should have taken her concerns more seriously. Now, for me, the point is about one of honesty, and it's one about putting your cards on the table and articulating a view of the world and society with regards to immigration with a degree of honesty and clarity, and acknowledging that people are going to disagree with you, and you're going to have to make the case. Now, Yvette Cooper's backed off from that entirely. The new Labour front bench, when it comes to articulating the case in terms of, you know, we're calling all the people that we're clapping on a Thursday night low skilled, so they're going part of the way to articulating that vision. But as long as you sort of frame it within exceptional conditions, well, when all of this is over, it's going to be really easy for people to forget that they did step out on their doorstep and clap every Thursday. And they're not necessarily going to make the connections between who's been dying to, you know, keep the country going during this time and the kind of people who are going to be excluded from making a life here. It won't happen unless you take the opportunity at these totemic moments to articulate a vision for something much better, much bigger, much more compelling.
Okay, we've got over 2,000 watching. Thank you for joining the show. If you're new to this, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And we broadcast this show 3 times a week. And there's a weekly big interview from Aaron Bastani. Also, like the video. We've only got around 650 likes. We should get that much closer to 2,000. And a super chat from Super 8 with a £5 super chat. This is some advice for you, Ash. Maybe consider a replotting of the cheese plant. It looks like it needs more space. Aaron, you want to come in before I start the next story?
Yeah, it's on the point that was just being made in regards to immigration. I think in the context of, you know, we know that probably around 55 to 60,000 people have died so far, many in elderly care homes. In that context, I think it's eminently pragmatic to say, look, we've just had tens of thousands of elderly people die. It's probably not wise to kick out a significant chunk of the people that look after our older people in this country. It's probably not the smartest thing to do. And I think, you know, again, at face value, most electorate will go, yeah, it's probably not that clever. I mean, we don't know how far we are into this crisis. There may be a second peak. We could end up having hundreds of thousands of people dying, primarily older people. Our care homes are far from safe. It just seems like a really mad thing to pass this legislation. Ash is right. The sort of disposition of Yvette Cooper, look, your vote doesn't matter. The Tories have a majority of 80. They have the numbers to pass the legislation. Yvette Cooper here reminds me of the kind of Democrats, you know, when the Republicans are in charge, the Democrats go, well, you know, we have to do this thing and we can't be bipartisan. And when the Democrats are in charge, like, you know, Barack Obama, the Republicans are like, shut everything down. Nothing moves until we get our way. And for me, that pathetic politics that you see on the centre left, it's not really centre left at all. It's very much in the centre. I mean, I think that's really embodied in this performance we saw today. And Ash is right. What do you think about immigration? We're leaving the EU, and I think I'm perfectly open about saying, yeah, that means you have to end freedom of movement with regards to the rest of the European Union. Absolutely. But then we on the left need to catalyze a conversation about what does a progressive immigration policy look like? What does it do with regards to asylum applications and so on? And also we need to tell people properly, look, the number of people in this country over 85 is going to double between now and the mid-2030s. That's going to increase care spending massively. It's going to create permanent budget deficits. It's going to clearly stretch the triple lock on pensions. On a purely economic basis, and I don't think any of us would make that argument, you're going to need more young people, you're going to need more immigrants. By the way, that's not a sustainable long-term argument because the aging trends are visible also in Asia, Africa, Latin America. It's not a permanent sort of argument, but in the short term, it's a perfectly coherent thing to say, and it's also true. Without younger people migrating to this country, without us having a well-resourced care system, which will include some of these people working in it, we will have a really severe social and economic crisis around aging within 10 to 15 years. And so whether it's an ethical argument or a pragmatic argument, It's a really easy one to make. And hey, why don't you do both at the same time? Turns out Yvette Cooper can't do either.
We've got Russell Cart right now of a super chat. Callous immigration policy shows true colours of this government, whilst unwanted immigrants save our lives. Odious, vile, unacceptable on all levels. This is an issue we are going to be talking about, seems like, over the next 4.5 years now on Novara Media. I would definitely not trust this government, especially with Priti Patel in the Home Office, to treat migrants in anything other than a completely callous and hostile way. The next story is a lighter one, and it's an entertaining one. It's about the Liberal Democrats. So they have released a report on the 2019 general election, which, to refresh your memory, started like this.
I never thought that I would stand here and say that I'm a candidate to be Prime Minister. But when I look at Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn, I am absolutely certain I could do a better job than either of them.
And that general election campaign ended like this.
The SNP, as you can see there, have taken East Dunbartonshire. Joe Swinson will no longer be an MP. Well, there's so many questions being asked, even during the campaign, about the nature of the Lib Dem campaign.
So, yes, the Lib Dems entered the 2019 general election pitching Joe Swinson as the next Prime Minister, and they ended up going down to 11 seats, with Joe Swinson herself losing her seat. As it stands, the Lib Dems still don't have a replacement leader. I think Ed Davey is currently the interim. So as I introduced at the beginning, the Lib Dems have done a report on the failure in that general election. It's supposed to be asking hard questions so that the party can rebuild. Let's go to some findings. So some findings from this report on Joe Swinson. Your candidate for Prime Minister had gone down well at conference to members, and as an ambitious reflection of polling from earlier in the year, it appeared unrealistic to the wider public, especially given that we were already falling in the polls. Now let's go to the Lib Dems on Brexit. So this is in the election review. We alienated large chunks of the population on Brexit. The electorate was divided into 3 groups. 20 to 25% passionate Remainers, 20 to 25% passionate Leavers, and 50 to 60% who weren't really that passionate either way. As a Liberal Party, we could never have gained votes from the 20 to 25% pro-Leave group, but we did effectively ignore the biggest group. And then finally, on the leadership team, this is again from the report, the word hubris was often used to describe the campaign attitude. While it was clearly unintentional, there was a definite sense of believing our own hype. And then they quoted a member who they'd interviewed for the report. That small group drunk the Kool-Aid and believed she could do it. So they're saying they genuinely believed that Joe Swinson could be Prime Minister. And finally, before I go to you, Ashton, Aaron, potentially the most interesting part of this report is not what was contained in it, but how it was briefed. And this report was briefed in a very explicit way to The Times, who led with this on the weekend. Lib Dems blame cult of Chuka Umunna for poll defeat. So really hanging him out to dry there. I'll start with Ash. What do you make of this report? Do you think they've been too harsh to Chuka? I mean, they're being very harsh to everyone, in fact. I mean, it was a pretty catastrophic general election campaign.
I mean, it was like the RuPaul Drag Race reading challenge where you just can't take your eyes away. It just gets more brutal and brutal as the read goes on. I do think that Chuka Umunna is being hung out to dry a bit, and I'm not a fan of how he's carried on in terms of his political strategy. I'm not a fan of his politics either. But I think in some ways it's a little bit of a case of blame a newcomer into the party and saying, you've got this all wrong and this is your fault. Whereas actually it was much more about Joe Swinson for me. I think it was her inability to take yes for an answer when it came to Parliament. You had the Labour Party being dragged incrementally further and further towards that pro-Remain position that she wanted, but she couldn't turn around and say, yes, I'm going to work with you in order to, frustrate a Brexit deal going through Parliament and forcing it to a second referendum by having some kind of minority government. She didn't take that opportunity when it was offered to her. And yes, that was in part because of absorbing all of these sort of, ex-Labour defectors who held a real deep antipathy right? Loathing of Jeremy Corbyn because he was sort of the great usurper of their Labour Party careers. It meant that she boxed herself off. But I think in addition to that, there was a genuine disdain for the politics of populism. Jo Swinson in her bones is a technocrat. She was actually much more hawkish on austerity than any Conservative was by, the time of 2019. And she, I think, saw herself as a kind of centrist savior of politics, with that, adopting of the spider badge and, the kind of girly SWAT t-shirt. And you kind of imagine her, if she was around 2020 politics, she'd be like, this Karen is the manager. Like, it's that kind of like, completely hollow liberal technocratic feminism, which has no basis in either the politics of people's everyday lives or the insurgent politics, which have dominated the political system over the past few years. So I think that the emphasis on Chuka Umunna, look, I love taking the piss out of him as much as anybody else. He stopped being a garage DJ and moved into Soulful House when the MCs came in, and that tells you all you need to know about him. But I think that the more fundamental problem was Jo Swinson, how she saw herself, how she conceived of politics, and her inability to take yes for an answer when a second referendum was a possibility through parliamentary mechanisms.
Well, I think the implication of the briefing is that Chuka Umunna was partly responsible for the hubris of Jo Swinson. So I remember the period where Chuka Umunna sort of had on his Twitter the shadow foreign secretary, and Ed Davey announced himself as shadow chancellor. And I suppose Jo Swinson must have called herself leader of the opposition, but they had this idea that they were a government in waiting. And I think the suggestion is that partly came from those Labour defectors.
And I think that
Aaron,
might be true. I think that might be true, but I think really when you see some of Jo Swinson's positioning even before that point, I don't think it's all Chuka, is what I'm saying.
Aaron.
She lost her seat, and these people are a humiliation to themselves. But the most tragic thing of all is they shaped the outcome of the 2019 general election arguably more than anybody else. Labour got 32%, which is obviously wasn't great. But when you consider there was a split at the beginning of the year, normally if a party splits, normally that's quite a big deal. You can look at 1981 to 3 with the formation of the SDP. Labour then proceeded to get, I think, 28%. It's often very bad news for a political party. So you had that split by people like Chuka Umunna, Chris Leslie, and so on. And then you had later on in the year those same people with Jo Swinson saying that they wouldn't work with Labour to have an interim sort of coalition government of some kind. And so the handmaids, the people that gave birth to this political moment of Boris Johnson being in charge at a moment of supreme national crisis, these people will take significant responsibility despite how useless they are. And I think Ash is right. It's a shame we don't have some kind of Jo Swinson 2020 Twitter account where she's kind of still carrying, we had the Miliband one if he'd won and what was going on during a Miliband premiership. Maybe we should be doing that with Jo Swinson. I mean, it was like a sort of FBP troll account became sentient. It was incredible. It was absolutely incredible. Yeah, debate her, this kind of deranged stuff, and people were like, what are you talking about? And it became like this thing. And what was really revealing was a significant part of the lobby were like, yeah, this is what people are really talking about right now.
And, because it's all people who are prefects at school. It chimes with them on a deeply resonant level. They see this overgrown head girl, coming onto the political arena, demanding to speak to somebody who's in charge, and go, yeah, this is a real grown-up.
But the saddest thing for me is that, a lot of Labour people got in bed with that. That's the saddest thing of all for me. I know people that were like Corbyn supporters who voted Lib Dem, not in the European elections, in the local elections, to give Labour a bloody nose. And I'm thinking, you've got councillors who could do amazing. So you might have a socialist running to be a councillor where you are. Why would you vote for the Liberal Democrats? And I think too many people, and that to me speaks about an absence of long-term political education on the British left. That's bigger than Jeremy Corbyn. That's bigger than Navarra Media. That goes back decades. And just don't be seduced by this nonsense. And then we had the whole thing about whether Europe. And look, we can talk about the Labour position. I think ultimately by 2019, they were in a bad place regardless. But the European elections never, ever mattered. They never mattered. You have a 35% turnout. Nobody's ever taken these elections seriously. And by the way, we know that because the Tories got what? 9%, right? Right now, in some polls, they're polling 50%. European elections do not matter. And yet again, a significant part of our sort of the lobby, of the sort of the people that are opinion makers around political journalism in this country, took it eminently seriously. And so the failure, the catastrophe, the calamity of Joe Swinson and Chuka Umunna, yes, it's derisable, it's laughable, but it also reflects on a really important point, which is that 10 years ago, the centrists, the moderates, the status quo fetishists had 3 political parties. And by December 2019, they only had one, and that was the Liberal Democrats. And they did terribly. So what does that say to you about the sort of the desire and the taste for change in this country? And by the way, it's not all entirely positive and progressive, quite a lot. And I still think for much of the commentary that's not really cut through, that actually you don't really have a control over any of the major parties anymore, and you don't really have any ideas to offer the electorate more generally. And it's something which still there hasn't been a reckoning with, I think.
I mean, I think there are 2 things which really need engaging with. And one is that the Lib Dems are completely ideologically bereft, right? You don't have that kind of tradition of, Charles Kennedy, Orange Book Lib Dems, who had something which they truly believed in, right? They had an ideological foundation. By 2019, it was David Cameron come again, right? And nobody wanted that. Nobody wanted that style of politics. It was David Cameron without the charisma, which really wasn't much of an offer at all. But there is, I think, a huge challenge for Labour, which I think is related to the way in which the Lib Dems are able to scupper Labour's chances in a few marginal seats. And it's because Labour has changed in a big way and occupies a very ambivalent place towards its own history. Something which was sort of partially resolved by Labour in 2017 and then came a cropper in 2019, which is Labour a party of civic-minded progressives, or is it a party of workers' struggle? Now, neither of those are easy answers, and I know that there are many on the left who would go, party of workers' struggle, that's that. I can just define it into existence and job done. Whereas actually a sense of, what is a collective identity for workers, and after 40 years of neoliberalism, after the demise of trade union organization and membership, after the gutting of working class residential centers through gentrification in metropolitan areas, but then also just the impoverishment and immiseration of lots of former industrial towns. That's not an easy answer. And were you to go, civic-minded progressives, professionals, well, good luck with that under a first past the post electoral system. You also won't even fashion a social majority necessarily out of that. So 2 very, very difficult things there. And also, I think, an ongoing struggle for the Lib Dems. But I think that, I made a lot of errors of judgment in 2019 in terms of where I thought things were going and what I thought I had to base my judgments on. And so now, rather than confidently setting out what the answers are to it, I'm trying to think about, okay, so what are the really pressing questions? And then other people can answer them, like you do.
Well, what's really interesting is that report, it says actually what people were saying in Labour. Like 50% of the country don't really care about this. All the noise is coming. And look, 25% is still a lot of people. They can make a lot of noise. They can attract a lot of funding. They can have protests with 1 million people, right? Then that's true. There were huge pro-EU second referendum protests. And the problem for Labour was they didn't catch, and if they had done that successfully, they would have won the election. They didn't get that 50% energized. And I don't think that was actually necessarily just about Brexit. I think it's very hard to do that when so much of your own party constantly denigrates you for 4 years. It would happen to Keir Starmer. If Keir Starmer had 2/3 of his parliamentary party saying he's an arsehole 7 days a week, the exact same thing would happen. And so, yes, it dovetails with Brexit and the EU stuff, but it's not the entire story.
We're going to go to our final story of the evening, which again is quite a fun one. First of all, you're watching Novara Media, you're watching Tiski Sour. As you know, this show is only possible because of your kind support. If you are already a subscriber, thank you very much. You make this possible. If not, please go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. Next story. We have spoken on this show about some of the smears that have been attempted against Keir Starmer. It hasn't been quite what was faced by Jeremy Corbyn, but this weekend there was one which was almost as ridiculous. So this was a Daily Mail headline, which we can get up now. Man of the people, new Labour leader Sir Keir owns land worth up to £10 million. So the story is that in 1996, Starmer bought this field. We might be able to get the map up as well. He bought this field for up to, well, it's worth up to £10 million, the map says. He bought that in 1996, just around the corner from his parents' house, which is worth about £500,000. Now, there's a couple of problems with this story. So the first is that the up to £10 million is doing a lot of work. So it's based on, Keir Starmer didn't buy the field for £10 million. It's not worth 10 million. No one's trying to buy the field for £10 million. How they've worked this out is they've said on that field there's space for 70 homes, and those homes in that particular area, if you added them all up, could be worth £10 million. The problem is that field doesn't have any planning permission. It's on the green belt, so you can't build 70 homes there. So it's a completely hypothetical amount of money which they have come up with. The second problem is the actual reason that Keir Starmer bought this field makes him seem really nice. So let's go to the comment from the Labour spokesman, which is in the same article. It's just towards the end of it. So a spokesman for the Labour leader said Keir purchased the field for his late disabled mother. The field was used to house donkeys that Keir's parents rescued and cared for. After his mother lost the ability to walk, the field allowed her to still watch the donkeys from her home. The field is not for sale, and no one, developer or otherwise, has been shown around it. Now, if you'd written that hit piece about this bit of land, which because of your, strange twists of logic, you've said is worth £10 million because you've sort of hypothetically built 70 houses on it, even though it doesn't have planning permission. So you've got to that point where you're writing this hit piece. Then you go to the Labour Party for comment, and their comment is that Keir Starmer bought this field for his disabled mother so that she could look at the donkeys without having to leave her house. Would you not think, oh, maybe this story is not going to work? No, it makes him seem really, really nice. We have our criticism of Keir Starmer on this, but this story about the donkey is heartwarming, which is, and it did backfire because this is what people noticed on Twitter. We'll get up a couple. There were loads. It was trending on Twitter, in fact. So star of Dragon's Den and Strictly Come Dancing star Deborah Meaden. Anybody who buys land to rescue donkeys is all right by me. She has about 500,000 followers. And I quite like this from comedian Alex Keeley. Keir Starmer is in the pocket of big donkey. Now, I mean, there's sort of two responses to this one. So that I've seen sort of on left Twitter. And one of them is to say, look, this is what they did to Jeremy Corbyn. They'll find any story, however harmless, and they'll use it to try and undermine the leader of the Labour Party. When will these people learn? They'll always find something. The other argument is to say the difference between Jeremy Corbyn and Keir Starmer is that when they dug for dirt on Jeremy Corbyn, they could find stuff which, on foreign policy, which in many cases they're some of the reasons we support him, the anti-imperialism, for example, but they are stuff which can put him at opposition with mainstream public opinion in certain instances, not in all of them in terms of just being anti-war in the Middle East. And I suppose the third option is that they would find harder stuff on Keir Starmer if he was more of a threat to the establishment. But I mean, what do you guys think is going on here? We've seen, I suppose, a few weak smears against Keir Starmer. We talked last week about the one where he was supposed to be only clapping for the cameras when it came for clap for carers, because he said, are you done now to the cameras? It turned out he just wanted his daughter to come back to his house. Again, the truth there made him seem quite nice, which was just he was asking a cameraman to move so that his daughter could come back. And now it's about this donkey sanctuary. I mean, how do you think we should interpret the relationship between the press and Keir Starmer? Is it that there's less dirt? Is it that they can't be bothered to find the dirt because actually he's quite friendly to the establishment? Or is this just the first of what will become a much more serious campaign of delegitimization when they dig up stuff more serious than he bought a field for a donkey sanctuary.
May I come in here?
Yeah, go for it, Ash.
Okay, I mean, one, it made me feel terrible about myself because I was like, I bought my mum some flowers from Morrison's. I have never bought her land to look at donkeys. She quite likes donkeys. So yeah, I felt awful reading that story. But when it comes to thinking about the press and Keir Starmer, I think you've got to work out where are we now and where could things go based on what's happened before. So where we are now is a honeymoon period, which isn't just defined by him being, a former barrister, someone who looks very good in a suit. He looks like he could play a prime minister on a BBC drama. It's also, in the long shadow of Corbyn, a way of articulating your disdain for the previous management. So you've got all sorts of people falling over themselves to go, look how much better this is than what came before. And that includes people, on the right as well. So, conservative commentators, right-wing politicians, George Osborne being a classic example. And I think that's less about Keir's skills, though they aren't, considerable, and more about going, see, fuck you, Corbynistas. So that's really shaping where we are now, is that it's a way of just sort of, seeming to kick the left when it's down. But that's not necessarily going to last forever. Adversarial politics will make a huge comeback, I think, especially as lockdown restrictions start to ease and, the Conservatives are perhaps a little bit more worried about their polling. And I imagine that the smears against Keir Starmer are going to involve a kind of above and below. So in terms of the above, which is what you can see in the pages of the Mail on Sunday or the Telegraph, so on and so forth, is going to be Miliband 2.0. So haughty, out of touch, bit awkward, bit weird, very metropolitan, and doesn't live the life of an authentic Labour man of the people. And I think that in terms of the stuff that will come from below, which is what we were talking about last week, which is media which is not public facing, in particular that far right media ecology. It's going to be lots of stuff about his time as director of public prosecutions, particularly around issues like Jimmy Savile and paedophilia and grooming gangs, because they're so emotive and because there is a real feeling, and a legitimate one, that victims were failed by the criminal justice system. And I think that people play very, very dirty to make that stick on Keir Starmer. The real make or break for him will be whether there is a robust firewall between that above hostile media strategy and the below hostile media strategy. I think that it was much earlier than I'd anticipated that you would see this kind of, subterranean conspiratorial stuff make it, through to conservative frontbenchers like Nadine Dorries, or indeed backbenchers like Lucy Allen and Maria Caulfield. And what worries me is that Keir Starmer is trying to play by the rules and to come across as very statesman-like, someone who's got an eye on the bigger picture. He's wanting to address this crisis as though he's already in a government of national unity and not as some, an opposition leader who's sort of fighting to establish his legitimacy the way that Jeremy Corbyn had to. But in a little Twitter back and forth with John McTernan, comrade John McTernan, one of the things that he said was, well, you set the standard for what you'll accept by what you'll walk past. So if you don't crack down on this stuff really hard now, and you don't drag it out into the light and contest it in a public setting, these things have got the room to get much worse.
I'm going to go to you in a moment, Aaron. First of all, I want to introduce sort of a new angle, which isn't just how threadbare this story was, this hit piece was, but also how hypocritical it was for this to come from the Daily Mail, this story about how dare someone own land which might be worth some money. Now, I mean, we're not into big landowners. I don't think this story really presents Keir Starmer as that big a landowner. He bought a field for some donkeys. But in any case, let's get up this tweet from Guy Shrubsole, who is the author of the book Who Owns England? So he pointed out that if the Mail were concerned about concentrated land ownership, they should look closer to home. So the owner of the Daily Mail and Mail on Sunday, Viscount Rothermere, owns 4,700 acres in Dorset and Wiltshire, some of it via offshore firms based in tax havens. But they'd rather talk about Keir Starmer's donkey field. Now we can go into some of the details about that estate, which Viscount Rothermere owns. Obviously, Viscount Rothermere is the owner of the Daily Mail, who inherited both that job and that title from his father, who inherited it from his father, who inherited it from his father. So this is someone who hasn't, Aaron's pointed out in the comments, Viscount, not Viscount, who hasn't particularly earned his wealth and success. Let's go to the graphic about the details about his estate. In 2015, Viscount Rothermere acquired the 4,700 acre Bryanston estate in Dorset from the Crown Estate. The Crown Estate's press release states it was sold to a UK company held on behalf of the Viscount Rothermere and his son, the Honourable Veer Harmsworth, for an undisclosed sum. It turned out to be £43 million. That UK-based company, it transpires, is called Bryanston Limited, and though its company's house accounts here confirm it is registered in the UK, its latest 2018 accounts show that its immediate shareholders are two Jersey-based firms. Again, no wrongdoing is suggested, and it is unclear if any implications this has for the estate's tax status. Now, Guy Shrubsole there is clear to say that you can't pin on Viscount Rothermere any illegality or wrongdoing there, but we all know why it is that wealthy people often put the ownership of big assets in places like Jersey, tax havens like Jersey. Also, Jonathan Harmsworth, who is the fourth Viscount Rothermere, is a non-dom. So he's a non-dom. For tax purposes, he's registered as living abroad. He's estimated as being worth £1 billion. So for this guy's newspaper, which he owns, to be haranguing a Labour leader for owning some little field with donkeys on it, when he owns a £43 million estate whose owners are registered in a tax haven, it seems all a little bit much, doesn't it, Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a comedy, really. But I want to return really to the point what Ash made, which is this isn't going away. And if people, let's look at it through the prism of how the media treated Ed Miliband and Gordon Brown. Ed Miliband was villainized because he ate a bacon sandwich in a weird way. Ed Miliband was villainized because he beat his brother in a leadership contest and because his dad was a Marxist intellectual. Gordon Brown was hated. Gordon Brown to this day is hated by a certain subsection. And people go, oh, wow, these people are attacking Corbyn. That's Middle England. No, these are the same psychopaths who are saying EUSSR, Gordon Brown should be hung, strawn and quartered. They've always existed. They're just incredibly vocal. I remember, that one-eyed mad Scot, he sold all the gold. These crazy conspiracy theories, which, by the way, that disposition to politics has only intensified in the last decade because of the rise of the internet and social media, WhatsApp. And I think, look, if they can do it to Ed Miliband, they can do it to Gordon Brown, they sure as hell can do it to Keir Starmer. And yes, at first it's quite humorous, but Keir Starmer's positive approval ratings, everybody's talking about them, these positive approval ratings, at this same stage, in terms of going into the tenure of his leadership, Ed Miliband, I think, was plus 15. Keir Starmer was about plus 15. What happens to Ed Miliband? He was a figure of real hatred and spite, but often in a comic, humorous way from the tabloids. One thing that is playing for Keir Starmer here is this. Most of these outlets won't exist in 4 years' time. Most of them will be bankrupt. And so I think Ash is right, actually. And this is the most concerning thing for Keir Starmer, is that the above stuff, the tabloids, the kind of stuff that gets reviewed on the BBC, that's going to be weaker in 4 years than it is today. And that was the stuff that took Ed Miliband and Gordon Brown down. What's going to be a lot stronger is the back channel stuff, the fake Facebook ads, the clipped Twitter videos misrepresenting what you've said, which get rapidly shared through private networks like WhatsApp and Telegram and Signal. That's the stuff that's going to grow. And so Ash is absolutely right. The idea that you can just dismiss this, I think, is very, very deeply misguided.
All right, let's call it a night. Ash and Aaron, you've both been fabulous as always. Thank you for your super chats tonight. If you do want to support us directly, you can go to novaramedia.com/support. We appreciate it so much. Tiski Sal will be back tomorrow night. Slight change of schedule this week. That's because the Bastani Factor with Aaron Bastani will be on Wednesday with Rutger Bregman. Tomorrow we've got John Ashton, who's a leading public health expert on the show, and Faiza Shaheen from Class, and I'll be co-hosting with Dahlia, so that'll be so much for you to watch there. Make sure you hit subscribe not to miss any of the rest of the broadcast this week. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.